Let me ask you something. Why does the United States care so much about Venezuela? Why does a country far away in South America keep appearing in U.S. foreign policy debates? Why does Venezuela get more attention from Washington than many other countries facing similar problems? And most importantly, why does Venezuela matter to the United States at all? At first glance, this seems confusing. Venezuela is not a global superpower. It is not a major military threat to the US. It does not have the world's largest economy. So, why is it constantly discussed in American politics, diplomacy, and sanctions? Is it because of oil? Venezuela has some of the largest oil reserves in the world. But here's the real question. If the United States is now one of the world's biggest energy producers, why should Venezuelan oil still matter? Why do oil markets react when Venezuela's production changes? And why do U.S. sanctions often focus specifically on Venezuela's oil sector? If oil is no longer everything, then why does it still sit at the center of this relationship? Now, let's think about geography. Why does Venezuela's location matter so much? Why does the U.S. pay close attention to what happens in the Caribbean and northern South America? How important are shipping routes, sea lanes, and proximity to the U.S. mainland? If Venezuela were located on another continent, would it still receive this level of attention? Then there is politics. Is the U.S. relationship with Venezuela really about democracy and human rights? If that's the case, why does Venezuela stand out compared to other countries with similar issues? Why has Venezuela become such a powerful symbol in U.S. political debates? And why do different U.S. administrations, even with opposing ideologies, often maintain pressure on Venezuela? Now consider migration. Why has Venezuela's crisis led to one of the largest migration waves in recent history? How does that migration affect neighboring countries? And eventually, the United States? Why does a crisis inside Venezuela end up influencing U.S. border policy, asylum decisions, and domestic politics? And finally, let's talk about power. Why do countries like Russia, China, and Iran care about Venezuela? Why does the United States see their involvement there as a problem? Is Venezuela just a country in crisis? Or is it a strategic space in a much larger global competition? So when we ask, why does Venezuela matter to the United States? Are we really asking about oil, geography, migration, politics, or something deeper? To answer that, we need to look beyond headlines and understand the systems at work. To truly understand why Venezuela matters to the United States, we need to move from asking questions to examining connections, because this relationship is not driven by a single issue. It is built on overlapping systems of power. Let's return to oil. But this time, think beyond fuel. Is oil only about energy, or is it also about leverage? When a country controls some of the world's largest oil reserves, who ultimately benefits from that control? And in a global economy, can disruptions in one major oil producing country ever remain isolated? Even though the United States produces large amounts of its own energy today, global oil prices still affect American inflation, transportation costs, and domestic politics. So, when Venezuelan oil production collapses or returns, does it really stay a distant issue? Or does it quietly ripple through the global system and land back at home? Now, let's think about geography. Not just where Venezuela is, but where it sits relative to power. Why has the United States historically paid close attention to Latin America? Why is influence in the Western Hemisphere treated so differently from influence elsewhere? And why does Washington react strongly when rival powers increase their presence in this region? If countries like Russia, China, or Iran were expanding influence thousands of miles away, would it trigger the same concern? Or does proximity fundamentally change how power is perceived? This brings us to strategy. Is U.S. policy toward Venezuela driven primarily by values like democracy and human rights? Or is it driven by long term strategic calculations? And why does Venezuela often appear at the intersection of both moral language and hard power? Now consider migration, one of the most overlooked connections. When millions of people leave a country, does that remain a foreign problem? Or does it slowly become a regional and domestic issue for nearby nations? How do large migration flows affect border policy, asylum systems, labor markets, and political debates inside the United States? At what point does instability abroad transform into pressure at home? Then there's the question of tools. If Venezuela matters so much, why hasn't the United States invaded it? Why rely instead on sanctions, diplomacy, international pressure, and alliances? What does this tell us about how power is exercised in the modern world? Has influence shifted from military force to economic and political leverage? And are sanctions today more powerful than armies were in the past? Now ask yourself something deeper. What happens if the United States simply disengages from Venezuela? Does the situation stabilize on its own? Or does another power step in to fill the vacuum? History suggests that power vacuums rarely stay empty. And if another country gains influence in Venezuela, economically, militarily, or politically, does that reshape the balance of power in the region? Does it affect U.S. credibility among allies? Does it change how other countries respond to American leadership? This is where everything connects. Venezuela matters to the United States not because of one headline or one crisis, but because it sits at a crossroads of energy markets, geographic proximity, migration flows, ideological influence, and global competition. It reveals an uncomfortable truth about modern power, that influence is rarely dramatic, rarely simple, and rarely limited to one country. So the real question is no longer just why does Venezuela matter to the United States? The deeper question is what does Venezuela reveal about how power actually works in today's world?